Alright, so to follow the Road to Perdition Miller's Crossing video, I figured we'd do something a little lighter and go into the direction of the camp movie, which I guess you could say is its own genre, its own, like, subgenre in comedy. But where you have stuff like Meatballs, which I probably could have done with something in the kind of more, classic way. You see this genre with stuff like there's a whole array of those, camp themed comedies. And with Wet on American Summer, I probably could have done, like another David Wayne movie or something involving the cast of the state. But I just kind of felt the need to put them together. I think because of their their different approaches to it. Where Mayballs is, like I was saying, kind of a probably the classic case of the camp themed comedy, whereas Wet on American Summer is a parody, and it's like a parody of what? I don't, like, specifically, I don't think anybody really knows. But the glorious thing about Wet on American Summer is it doesn't really matter because you get it anyway. If you're going to get it, you're going to get it, but we'll get into that. First, I think I want to start with Meatballs, where it is a movie that could probably seem quite dated, not just in, its sense of humor, but it's in the certain jokes in general might seem a bit off. But that seems to be the case for a lot of the classic comedies as it goes on. My sheriff being Exhibit A. There will be some jokes that seem maybe a bit more fucked up now than they did back then. Meatballs is 5 years older than Revenge of the Nerds. We're going way back to '79 for this, which, as you can probably guess, means that this was, I believe, the first starring role for Bill Murray. He had popped up in a couple of things, and obviously had Saturday Night Live going on, but as far as a starring role in a movie, I believe this was the start of that, and it was also the first major movie by Ivan Reitman, and of course their teaming would go on to do great things later also. And on top of that, also you have Harold Ramis being one of the writers. So it's like it was almost like a starting point where we would see a whole bunch of stuff in classic comedies come to be. And yeah, you can tell right away that Bill Murray is probably really easy to group with those certain actors that are considered that a lot of their characters are basically movie versions of themselves, to the point that not only does that come through in the sense of humor of the character of Tripper, but he's even like Bill Murray's actually like wearing his own clothes in this movie. So that all comes through, but despite that, he does still feel like sort of the embodiment of that character, like the character we would go on to see, like when we would see Venkman, or when we would see like Winger and Stripes or something like that. But there's still a sort of charm to the character. You can even throw his character in Tootsie into this. Um, but I think it's really the way he interacts with the other cast members that really makes this character stand out in a way, because later on in his career with characters like Venkman or Winger or whatever, is they have this sort of asshole underlying quality to them also, or sometimes not so underlying. But there is some, like, when you compare him to the other characters, there's almost something so pure about Trooper. I guess that'd be the word, because he does have his asshole elements there, but the character just overall seems good natured, much more so than the later characters we'd see by Murray that seem to have this same personality, but there's a little something different to this one. Like, take for instance the scene that I can't imagine you'd get with some of those other um, lovable asshole Murray characters, where we have the moments with Gurner, like the main kid, where we see him, they're on the soccer field and the team is throwing a hissy fit because he's not athletic and he's stuck on their team, which is extremely relatable for a lot of people. So immediately, especially if you're a person like me, you'll kind of see, like, Gurner could be seen as, like, the cliche character that's eventually going to have his come back in a case like this and has trouble doing pretty much everything. But when you relate to the character, it actually does come through, especially when you get these really real moments between him and Murray, where there's the scene when Tripper tries to make him feel better after he's left the soccer field, and Tripper has that whole speech about how if you make only one really good friend over the summer, then you're doing something right. Like, that's all you need to do. You don't need to worry about anything else. As long as you make one really good friend, and then pretty much the rest of their scenes throughout the movie establish that. There's what this movie does so well is it establishes things like early, and then the movie can just do whatever it's gonna do. Because obviously there's not much in the way of plot, but that's kind of the good thing about it, is because they get stuff like that out of the way early, and then you can just kind of like the characters and watch them going from one thing to the next, and that's pretty much all the movie is, and that's really what the appeal of it is to it. Because you get stuff like the scene when they're playing cards for peanuts, just feels like, especially if you've seen the movie enough times, feels like you're just hanging out with characters that you already know. And it's only like midway through the movie. Like, the introductory period of everything is so quick that everything kind of feels lived in. So then they can just go from scene to scene or gag to gag or whatever, and it surprisingly works. And then you've also got stuff where it kind of feels like, even though this was like early in the, when you think about that array of camp movies, it still feels like they're almost like subverting some stuff. Like when you, like some of the stuff you would see them parody in Wet Hot American Summer, like the way everybody lusts after, you know, women, like the Elizabeth Banks character. Whereas in Meatballs, the object of Tripper's affection is Roxanne, and Roxanne is like this sort of unassuming tomboy, the kind of part that you wouldn't expect to see the main character going after in a movie like this, and that's what it is. And then you've got stuff like when Crockett gets kidnapped by Candace, and she has him in the boat, and she pretty much confesses her feelings to him. And this is like at the beginning of the movie. This is like the kind of grand gesture that would be done at the end of a movie for a character that's been feeling something inside the whole time that they don't want to let out. And it's basically how these characters are introduced to each other in the movie. And then the rest of the movie can just go on from there. And I love the way they get that out of the way. Now, the whole thing about monogamous relationships at this camp between these characters is briefly negated almost entirely by this dance scene where everybody's just kind of going after everybody. There's the weird thing where they split up the virgins and the non-virgins, and the guys are arguing over which group they're going to get to go into, and it's to hit on people, and it's, yeah, I don't know. Some of it seems misplaced, but it's there. And if you want to talk about, you know, some of the stuff that feels like maybe fucked up now, that you're kind of, I don't know if in '79 it would have still been weird, but you get stuff like at the beginning of the movie when they go to like that girls section, and they Tripper says these are the 14-year-olds, and it's like he says they've got the drive, they got the equipment, but they don't have the experience, and he has to tell the dudes with him that practically have mustaches at this point, he has to tell them to not give the 14-year-olds that experience. It's a little, and then one of the characters, like one of the other counselors, actually refers to them as the jailbait. It's weird. It's a little weird. It feels a little off. But when you get past that, like I said, the likability of the characters goes a long way, and nothing like things like that are said, but what you necessarily can't say about some other movies. Nothing particularly fucked up is like actually going to happen. I know that sounds like a weird defense, but yeah, it's really just in like those, you know, throwaway moments of dialogue where you're just like, oh well, that's kind of fucked up in retrospect. But yeah, it's, for the most part, the movie does actually have like an innocence to it, which that stuff kind of comes in and kind of, I think that's why that stuff is so weird when it happens, because the rest of the movie feels so, has that innocence about it. But that's the way it carries that is what ends up making the movie work in the long run. And because you do end up with stuff like I was saying, there's no real plot, but obviously eventually we're going to get to the whole, there's a competition with another group sort of thing, because you have to have a climax of some kind. So, but the great thing about this, and talking about those things that are, it feels like it's subverting stuff even though it feels so early in the genre, is the fact that they don't care if they win or lose. They start a whole chant about how they don't care if they win or lose before anything's even happened. And this is even hinted at early at the basketball game, when it's like, yeah, they're losing, but there's nothing really particularly dramatic about it. Just Tripper finally saying, okay, if we're gonna lose, we're gonna lose in style then, and they do the thing where they like drop the other team's shorts and stuff like that. And so that's basically what the thing is it doesn't matter if you win or lose, but if you're going to lose, lose triumphantly, which which I think is actually a really good thing to take away from it, especially the way they handle it, because it's like when you go into the climax of the thing, you expect it, because it becomes tiresome when you get the whole thing of they're really, really trying, and it'll seem like they're failing, but then they'll come back and win in some big way or something. It's the ultimate cliche. But the fact that that's pretty much what happens, but the fact that they don't dramatize it because they go into it saying, who cares? And that's like really refreshing. And then they actually end up earning it because we do have the cliche moments where, like, the geeks get their moment to shine. Like you got like when Spaz is doing the race with the stacking of the teacups thing. Which is still really well done because like over half of that is done in like the one take where we're actually watching it in real time. And then there's, Fink having to eat the hot dogs and all that. So those moments are in there, but like I said, the fact that they ignore the idea of there being real stakes in this, because it's almost like the movie realizes the ridiculousness of this thing, this race being considered, this competition or whatever, being considered high stakes. It just doesn't. And so they pretty much just, the movie itself treats it as it is, just a game of sorts, and it's like if they win, that'd be great, but if not, whatever. But then it kind of starts to change pace, like I said, in an earned way, though, because it's like we do eventually get to the point where when it does start to look like they could actually win, then we kind of want them to, and they kind of want to. So when it gets to this final thing with the race where Gurner finally gets his moment to shine, and like I said, the way they set him up as a totally relatable character does make this work and kind of surpasses the whole cliche thing. But I like the way it's handled, where the idea of taking this race seriously now when they're running through the woods is that the sort of not, there's no real fanfare about the way it's presented. The entire first half of this race, when they're running, they're just running to no music or anything and no cheering because they're around nobody. It's just the sound of them running and breathing. And then the music eventually comes in when it starts to get more triumphant and we know what direction it's going to go. And yeah, that just feels like such a unique approach to this, despite the fact that most of the movies in this genre were probably aspiring to be this movie, but ended up creating the cliches themselves that you can't find in this movie, or that this movie does in a way that works and doesn't feel tired. So, and to go back and watch something like this now, inappropriate jokes aside, the fact that the stuff like that has aged so well, the whole kind of avoiding cliches and when you're doing them, making them work, it's crazy how much that actually, yeah. So, so it really just kind of feels like one of those movies you just sort of hang out with. Like, you can just pretty much put it on whenever, and it doesn't really get old. And for a movie that's getting older and older, from 1979, I think that really says something. Or maybe that's just me. Maybe I like this movie more than other people do. It is... I remember growing up, it was considered one of, like, the Murray classics, but I feel like as time has gone on, it's kind of dropped off a little bit, and it's not necessarily one of the first few that are brought up when you think of Murray's classic movies, but I've always really liked it for one reason or another. The reasons I stated, mostly. And yeah, it did end up spawning 2 sequels, which I don't really remember. Regardless of how much David Spade's Carl with a K built up the third one. It's still... anybody that understands that reference, I really, really appreciate you. So, let's go on to Wet Hot American Summer now, where it does take this sort of camp genre and go into full-on parody. Once again, I think that might be what it is, but it's like the more obscure it feels and what exactly it's trying to do, the funnier it's probably going to be, because this is one of those movies where when it came out, nobody really liked it. The critics completely ripped it apart, and nobody really saw it, and then it ultimately found its cult following. And it's kind of the perfect cult following movie, because when you know about, you know, the state, the whole sort of troupe of all these guys, and then they had the show on MTV for a few years or a few seasons. Once you know those guys' sense of humor, or you know these guys going in, then the whole movie, like the whole movie's sense of humor, basically feels like one giant in joke. And it's one of those cases where it's always kind of an interesting moment to show this movie to people because, like I was saying at the start, either this is a movie you're on board with early or you're not. And if you're on board early, then just about every joke is gonna hit in a really big way, no matter how dumb or nonsensical it may be. And the more dumb and the more nonsensical, the better. Like one of the early jokes, like they start their running jokes really early and really fast. Like take for instance the first scene between Jenny Garofalo and David I. Pierce, and there's that running joke of Garofalo throws the shovel and we hear the sound. It just flies off screen and we hear the sound of a pot breaking. And then, before this scene is even over, that joke comes back where we see David I. Pierce throw another shovel, and we see where it lands. It just hits the grass and kind of nudges the house a little bit, and they do the pot breaking sound again, and this comes back. But the great thing about it is the way they handle this, because in the very next scene, Ken Marino throws down a glass bottle and it makes the paw breaking sound again. And you're like, oh, this is definitely a running joke, because this happens, the 3 times they use it are in the span of like 1 minute, like 60 seconds. And then you're like, oh, so this is a joke they're going to keep using. And then after Marino does it and that 3rd time happens in another scene, it doesn't come back for like an hour. And then it comes back at the most random time when Chris Maloney throws the can of vegetables off screen. And when it comes back after so long of being gone, it's hilarious. It's probably funnier than it was the first 3 times. And the way they're able to, like, savor a joke like that, to, like, ration a joke to where they make it seem like they're going to overuse it, and then they just surprise you with it. And then it comes back a couple more times after that. But because it waited so long, like, it never wears itself out. Even when they're in quick succession, it's always funny. Every time. And so stuff like that is brilliant. And you also get stuff like, sometimes they'll just throw in lines or jokes that you can barely even catch. Like, you may not even catch the first time. Like the time where, Showalter's talking to the girl and he says, you know, when we first started hanging out together this morning, and he goes through this whole thing of their memories talking about this morning. It's like, he says it so sincerely. It's almost like long after the fact you catch it was a joke. The fact that he mentions that it was only this morning that this started. And it's great to, like, use this movie as a test. Because there is one joke, I think. There's so many jokes also like this, and they're talking about showing this movie to other people. Either they're going to get it or they're not. And it's always fun to see when they get it. Like, when you show this to somebody and they get the humor, and they're, like, along for the ride, it's like, it feels like such a proud moment. And I feel like the joke, of all the jokes in this movie, the joke that's really the telling moment of, if you're showing this to somebody and they laugh at this moment, you have them, and the movie has them. And it's the moment when, literally, I was chasing Marino when he's going back to the camp after everything's broken down, and he runs into the bale of hay, and it's just one bale of hay in the middle of the road, and he can't get around it, and he has to jump over it. If you're showing this to somebody and they laugh at that joke, then you have them. Then everything will be smooth sailing from then on. That might be my favorite joke in the movie, honestly. But I do think, if I had to, because the interesting thing also about this movie, especially when you talk about it, the following that is gathered around it, is the cast. And the fact that this came out in 2001, and a lot of these people were kind of off the grid at this point. I want to say it was Bradley Cooper's first movie. And it was like a very early showing for a lot of these people. Paul Rudd, Elizabeth Banks, everybody. But the thing is if you had to point out an MVP of the cast, it would be very, very hard to do. My instinct would be to want to say Paul Rudd, because I really love this character. Whereas, because he's the thing that makes this character so easy to love is the fact that he is the biggest douchebag in the movie by far. But number one, he's like a spoof. He's a blatant spoof of the asshole boyfriend trope. But it's also, if you're... This is also kind of shows like how time is good to it. Is that now that we're as familiar as we are with Paul Rudd and the type of characters he usually plays, makes this character significantly funnier in retrospect than he probably was in 2001. It's just because if you saw this in 2001 and you weren't really that familiar with Paul Rudd, like this, it would seem really random because he was Paris and Romeo and Juliet, the Lorman version, which might seem weird, but the way he approaches this character, where he keeps going back and forth, like when he's making out with her, and then he's got his tongue down her throat, and then he stops and says he's being smothered. Then he says, "Fuck you, dyke," for some reason, and then says that he loves her, and then flips her off twice, all in the span of like 30 seconds. It is very much a clear, blatant spoof of this character that's handled perfectly. But then you've also got stuff like the tantrum, when Jane Garofalo tells him to get rid of his tray, and he throws it on the ground, and she makes him pick it up, and he does the perfect... It's almost eerie how perfectly he reenacts a child's tantrum after they've been told to pick something up. Like, if you've ever seen a child told to pick up a mess off the floor, this is exactly what it looks like. Like I said, to a weird degree, Paul Rudd really studied child tantrums before he shot this thing, you can tell. And then there's the whole running joke of him, bad things happening to children around him because he's so reckless, and then getting rid of the kids that witness these things by driving them out in the middle of nowhere and throwing them out onto the street. And apparently, this was supposed to be taken a step further in the original script, where he actually went as far... I do agree. Apparently it was David Wayne's dad that put a stop to this joke and said that it would have been way too dark. And I agree. In the movie it would have been way too dark, but to talk about it outside of the movie as a possibility is hilarious. And apparently there actually was a moment in the original script where instead of driving the kid out onto the road and throwing him onto the street, he actually went as far as to kill one of the kids to cover up a mistake he made. And that's the thing that kind of works in this way, where yes, in the movie it probably would have been way too dark and way from out of nowhere, but you can have a huge laugh just talking about the possibility. But that's not to say that the movie avoids dark jokes. There is some stuff in here. The whole... I mean, talking about, some of the stuff that hasn't aged well in Meatballs, talk about the Molly Shannon thing going on here with the kid. And I guess the real punchline of the joke is how no real attention is drawn to how weird it is. It just kind of exists, and nobody acknowledges it. But that's kind of the great thing about this movie, too, is that there's no... Like, in comedies like this, where things are, like, really out of control and really weird... Usually, they'll make the mistake of throwing in an audience surrogate, where it's like they don't trust the jokes to work enough by themselves, and to just throw the audience into it and say, you're on your own. Usually, a lesser movie throws in an audience surrogate so that all this stuff could be happening, and there's one character in the middle acknowledging that everything is weird and out of place. But that character is nowhere to be found in this. You are definitely on your own with these people. and that's the great thing about that also. But talking about some of the darker jokes, I have always liked the moment where they go into town. And it's always a really big deal when they go into town, because it's like, yeah, we get away from the kids, we get away from the camp and all that. And then it's like, hey, we're going to get beer and all that. And then this starts to escalate. To quote another Paul Rudd movie, this escalates quickly. This really gets out of hand fast. Where then the characters that kind of feel like the more innocent, at least when you compare them to the others, grab cocaine, they buy it from a dealer, and then there's this whole hard drugs montage. But the great thing about this and how dark this joke is them being in like the crack house is not even the punchline. The punchline is that they go back to the camp and they're all happy again. It was just another day in town, and we learned that all of this happened in the span of an hour. So the whole timeline of the movie is actually really funny also, because it feels like weeks, but like every time we see a card with the time that tells us that this is all in like a day and a half. And like there's a lot of stuff we're seeing that takes place in the span of a very small window of time. Like an hour and a half to 2 hours at most. Some of the big things in this movie happen. Um, yeah, so being able to do jokes that big and then make the punchline so nonchalant, I think, is also the magic of the sense of humor of this. And like I said, you've got people left and right. They got bigger over time. You've got Amy Poehler in here. You got I mentioned Elizabeth Banks. I would say anybody in the history of ever that has had a crush on Elizabeth Banks, it probably started with this movie. It would have had to, because Jesus. but anyway, I do think the one problem I do think I have is as it goes on, there is, because if there's one thing about most of David Wayne's movies, unfortunately, is that they are this funny. And like I said, that if you feel hooked into it, like I said, it feels like if you laugh at the jokes in this movie, you automatically feel like you're in on an in-joke. But there are some things like the Chris Maloney stuff, apart from him, bringing back the pot-breaking sound effect. I wish his stuff worked for me a little more. I've never really... That character's never really been that funny to me, compared to everything else going on also. And it's like, I feel like I love that they keep casting Chris Maloney, because they also used him in They Came Together, the Rudd movie that was like a spoof of romantic comedies, which I wasn't really that into. Like, it was a one-joke idea that they really... I appreciated the idea, but it didn't really end up working for me. And what they did with Maloney's character in that movie also was kind of like when I really started to realize that they were really stretching. Because obviously we see with the Harold and Kumar movies that he can be incredible with comedy, especially with his whole sort of Law and Order career that happened. It was seeing him in movies like this made it all the more like jarring and hilarious just based on his presence alone. But the stuff they give his character to do, I don't know if it works as well. And then you've got Garofalo's whole thing where she pretends to be into the stuff that David Hyde Pierce is into. Where it's... I was just realizing, did I go into the whole MVP of the cast thing? It'd be really hard. No, I didn't. I got sidetracked, because what I was going to say was David Hyde Pierce is my personal MVP, I think. Because you have the scenes where he's talking to Garofalo at the beginning. I'm coming back to what I was going to say. And it's... He goes to that whole thing where he's doing the whole, oh, I don't want to do that, no, I don't want to do that thing, and then he, like, snaps at her and says, I said no, and it's moments like that. He just really makes work, and, like, even the way he runs towards her at the end when he's holding the trophy. Everything about that character, I think, is great. But then we get into this, what I was getting ready to mention, was the whole thing where Janeane Garofalo gets put in, like, a George Costanza situation, and that basically becomes an entire subplot of the movie, where she tries to get into what he's into, and then it turns into this whole thing with, like, the meteor thing, and it's at that point, and at the talent, the combining the whole thing of you got the talent show and the meteor thing, I think is where it starts to kind of run out of steam, but which is really late in the movie, to its credit. So there is that, but it does really start to run dry there, and I do think it's moments like that where you can tell that sketch comedy is where these guys like Showalter and David Wayne and the rest really, really shine, because that does seem to be a trend in a lot of Wayne's movies, is they get something great going or they have a great idea, but usually, eventually, it starts to run dry, regardless of how successful or not successful it was going in. But even despite all that, this did manage to spawn 2 miniseries. There was the prequel series, which is a brilliant idea with the whole thing of bringing the cast back for a prequel, like years and years after the movie, like after they've really visibly aged. They play the same characters, only younger than they were in this movie, which is brilliant and amazing. And then they did the other one that was a sequel series like 2 years later. So they kept going back to it, and there was a lot of demand for them to go back to it. So good on them for pulling it off. But I do think the movie does sort of eventually run dry. But like I said, I think that's just them excelling in the sketch comedy area, to where being having to stretch it into like a full on story with some sort of closing is where it kind of falls short. But you know, yeah, still, it is still one of those things where you can always go back to it, and the jokes are still always funny, no matter how many times, not just you go back into the movie, but how many times those jokes are used in the movie itself. Um, but if I had to pick between one of these two, like I was saying, I just kind of have this affection for Meatballs on the way it just kind of still, actually holds out despite coming from 1979 and being the sort of, camp movie cliche and having a lot of that stuff in there, but also not doing some of that stuff is great. But as we would see, eventually it would spawn movies trying to be it that would eventually make us need movies like Wet Hot American Summer to bring us sort of back full circle. So, yeah, that's these. So, I'm not sure what the next one is exactly. I think I might have an idea, but then right after this, there is going to be more reviews of stuff like Vivarium and stuff like that, some of the on-demand stuff. And then we're going to start that Stephen King series and go from there. So those three things should keep us talking about for a while, because there is a whole list of like verses I was going to do, so all of that, and then some stuff that Owen's got, and so on. So until all that stuff, I think that's going to be it for the